Today we have Prof Skedzielewski, who is Skedzielewski. I'm sorry. I tried. I screwed it up. Sean is a graduate of Duquesne's philosophy program. Graduated with his master's this year, 2014. He is teaching at Rowan for his very first semester. This is brand new. He's already giving papers to us. I mean, what more can we possibly ask for? He broadly teaches and is interested in logic and continental philosophy, especially Heidegger, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, as well as Platonism and Stoicism, which is what he's going to be talking to us about today. Today he's going to give us a paper entitled The Confident and Amicable Life, a Defense of Stoicism. I'd like you guys to welcome Professor Skedzielewski.
Thanks, Ed. Good evening. See some familiar faces out here. That's a good sign. Some people from last week's lecture. All right, so I'm just going to dive right into this. If at any point you guys want to stop me if something I said is not clear, feel free to do that. That's not usually standard for these sorts of talks, but definitely feel free to do that. Otherwise, hold your sort of critical questions for the end. All right, so disjunctions multiply themselves in critiques of Stoicism to such an extent that one begins to grow suspicious. There is Nietzsche's provocative disjunction that one either minimizes both pleasure and pain or maximizes both pleasure and pain. Nussbaum at Chicago claims that the Stoic extirpates the passions in favor of a stolid security. Kelly and Dreyfus suggest the existence of a necessary relationship between Stoic autonomy and meaninglessness, as opposed to meaningful possibilities available in a life of openness and heteronomy, as they see it. Kierkegaard claims that the Stoic position trades away the God relationship and gains despair instead. If all these critics are correct, then the Stoics have renounced the world, given up on pleasure, repressed passion, destroyed the possibility of experiencing life as meaningful, and are in despair. It appears that it must be extremely difficult and unpleasant being a Stoic. However, I offer to aim to offer a reading of the Stoic life, focusing on Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, that is, the Roman Stoics, rather than the Greek ones, that is confident, engaged, and caring, contra to popular belief. The Stoics are concerned with three disciplines that are determined by the answers they give to three basic questions. Those questions are, what am I? Is there providence? And what is my responsibility with respect to others? The supposed results of the Stoic disciplines are what the critics I've just mentioned are primarily concerned with, namely apathy, nihilism, and despair. Each of these consequences correlates to one of the three domains and their respective, each of these three questions correlates to one of their respective domains, the domains of the self, the world or nature, and the domain of others. Obviously, none of these domains are mutually exclusive, right? The self and others are parts of nature. Others are also selves, and a self is an other to her community. But despite the organic unity of the whole, for explanatory purposes and for clarity, I'll deal with each criticism as it pertains to its particular domain. So despair is a result of the way in which a self relates to itself, right? In Kierkegaard's way of thinking, and as such, will be treated in the domain of the self, right? Kierkegaard's directing his criticism towards the Stoic conception of the self, rather than their conceptions of the community or the world. Nihilism and apathy are types of relations to the external world, to nature, and to things as well as to others. Because apathy, as Nussbaum criticizes it, is related to the responsibility we have with others, I'll save apathy for the domain of the community. Right? I will deal with nihilism in the domain of nature, or as the Stoics would put it, the domain of God's creation, where it more properly belongs, because of the lack of direct reference to communal responsibility, and an emphasis instead on the meaning or meaninglessness of events. Right? In this paper, I'll try to show then that the Stoic is not as despairing as supposed, is engaged with the world in the face of an apparent nihilism, and cares for others and the community. All right? So first step is to talk about the self and despair. Right? So I'm going to focus in on that discipline, that domain, and that critique first. Right? So Kierkegaard never really claims that he is interested in criticizing the Stoics directly, In the passage I'll focus on, his primary concern is with delineating a particular form of despair that he names, quote, despair to be oneself or defiance, unquote. In explaining this despair, Kierkegaard tries to satisfy the demands of an imaginary interlocutor. Quote, if a generic name for this despair is wanted, it could be called Stoicism, but understood as not referring only to that sect. This peculiar manner of identifying the Stoics indicates that the Stoic fits the mold of defiant despair, but is not exhaustive of the possible modes of that despair. Kierkegaard responds at once to an impertinent reader who needs to have, quote, generic names, unquote, for every category of despair, and at the same time admits that he does in fact have chiefly the Stoics in mind as an instance of the defiant variant of despair. So in this section, I'll try to show that Kierkegaard's existential critique of the Stoics is admissible insofar as the Stoics themselves have something like an existential project as one of the primary concerns in their philosophy. Secondly, I will assess the criticism, claiming ultimately that Kierkegaard has overlooked the importance of the Stoic dogma of providence. Connected with this assessment, I will show lastly that the dogma of providence is an essential element of Stoic attempts to guard against the onset of despair. Okay, so Kierkegaard's critique is twofold. There are two interconnected claims that I'll need to explain separately first in order to fit them together. The first part of the critique is the claim that the Stoic does not successfully become a self. For the Stoics, correct judgment has as its standard knowing what is within one's control and what is outside of one's control. Okay? Only that which is within one's control can be good or bad. Importantly, knowing what is within one's control is not merely an epistemological problem, but is rather part of a discipline or an art of living. It is important to notice that the Stoics want to do more than know about the self. If they were merely concerned with knowledge of the self, then Kierkegaard's criticism that the Stoic, quote, really becomes no self, unquote, would be non sequitur, insofar as the criticism supposes that the Stoics want more than knowledge of what the self is. To claim that the Stoics fail to be a self or become no self at all is to assume they wanted to become a self in the first place, right? And this needs to be demonstrated before Kierkegaard's criticism can stick. So a metaphor from Epictetus will serve to illustrate that the Stoics do indeed want to become themselves as Kierkegaard thinks they do. Quote Epictetus, for as wood is the material of the carpenter and marble that of the sculptor, so the subject matter of the art of life is the life of the self, unquote. The carpenter and the philosopher both have a subject matter, wood for the one and the self for the other. In the same way that the carpenter selects the best wood to work with, the philosopher selects only that which is properly part of himself as his subject matter and excludes things like the body and possessions. The carpenter uses a variety of tools for working on the wood that is his, and the Stoic has a variety of disciplines and practices with which she works on herself. A proper beginning for a project must also have an aim in mind, perhaps a bookcase or a table for the carpenter, and becoming oneself for the philosopher. Right? Zeus, as interlocutor, says to Epictetus, quote, if you take care of it, and it here is reason, and identify with it, you will never be blocked or frustrated, unquote. It is clear then that the Stoics want more than knowledge of the self. They want to identify with what is properly themselves, namely reason. Reason is, after all, the only thing that can be good or bad on the Stoic view. Kierkegaard's formulation for the same phenomenon of identifying with what is properly oneself is, quote, willing to be oneself, unquote, or more generally, becoming oneself. The second part of Kierkegaard's critique centers around a particular notion of piety. Kierkegaard claims that the Stoic is in a state of defiance of God, rather than piously recognizing that one's selfhood is derivative, that is, contingent upon a relationship with God. I'll address this criticism below, but for now it must be shown that the Stoics do in fact have a conception of piety that involves contingency or dependence on God. Otherwise, Kierkegaard's criticism would fail yet again to defeat the Stoics on their own grounds. So Arian, the sort of scribe of Epictetus, the person who writes down his lectures, chooses to begin Epictetus's discourses with a conversation Epictetus has with himself and an imaginary Zeus as his interlocutor, right? Some of which has already been quoted. The point of using Zeus rather than anyone else as an interlocutor is precisely to show that we are endowed with reason only by the will of Zeus himself, and that we don't acquire reason on our own, or find it in a field, or have it passed down to us from our parents. Right? Epictetus recognizes that Zeus has given us, quote, the best and most efficacious gift, unquote. And Epictetus is very, quote, he's very grateful. Quote, it's more than enough, that is the gift. Thank you, he says in the dialogue, unquote. Clearly then, Zeus is also used here so that Epictetus can show what he takes to be the correct disposition to have towards the gifts of God, namely a grateful and humble disposition. Clearly then there is a sense in which the Stoics emphasize piety towards God, where God is the foundation of reason and therefore the foundation of oneself. Arrian's rhetorical choice to begin the discourses this way further illustrates that, at least in his conception of Stoicism, piety was a central tenet. I will now begin fitting these two criticisms together into their dialectical unity. Right? Kierkegaard, in responding to Hegel, sort of takes up this technique. For Kierkegaard, a self that relates only to itself will be in despair. Right? Only if the self, as master of itself, relates to its subordinate position as a contingency dependent on God for its existence, can the self finally be free from despair and be a self in the proper sense. The God relation here is not then merely a relation between self and God, but rather has a more complicated dialectical character. The self, in relating to itself, also relates to that which established the possibility of such self-relation, God. There is then an annihilation before God and a concretization through God in Kierkegaard's view. Failing to recognize their dependence on God in this way, Kierkegaard claims that in Stoicism, quote, and this is a heavy one, the self is its own master in the Stoic view, and precisely this is the despair. On closer examination, however, it is easy to see that this absolute ruler, the Stoic, is a king without a country, actually ruling over nothing. His sovereignty is subordinate to the dialectic that rebellion is legitimate at any moment. I get goosebumps every time I read that quote. Rebellion here refers to the possibility of the Stoic giving up being himself at any moment, right? Of identifying himself with something other than reason, right? There is nothing inherent in the relation as such that the self has to itself in Stoicism that precludes the possibility of failing to be a self. That is, there is no guarantee of remaining a self after having become one. So despite the fact that the Stoics see reason as a gift from God, that they are grateful to God for this gift, and even that God and man are the same insofar as they possess the ability to reason, there is no evidence that they think of God as essential to their ability to identify as reason. Of course, God is necessary for the existence of reason on the Stoic view, but God is not necessary for the act of self-identification, with the act of self-identification with reason that the Stoic performs through the discipline of judgment. Okay? So there are at least two different answers to this criticism of Kierkegaard's. The easiest answer is to point out that the Stoics do not always claim to achieve an absolute relation to themselves, like Kierkegaard wants, a relation that would be permanent, unchangeable, or eternal. The self can be itself or not be itself, as one's will dictates and as circumstance urges. In this way, the legitimacy of rebellion just isn't a problem on the Stoic view, that we can sort of bite the bullet as a Stoic if we wanted to. Kierkegaard would grant that in this limited and tenuous sense, then, the Stoic could become a self. The second, more difficult but superior answer involves addressing whether or not the Stoic truly exists with the ever-present possibility of legitimate rebellion against the self as reason. Kierkegaard thinks that legitimate rebellion is always possible because the self is the master of itself and can at any time revoke its own sovereignty. This is factically true, but the Stoics have a normative ideal that guides their judgment in this matter. As quoted above, Epictetus holds that reason is a gift from God, and as such is most properly what the self is. Seneca describes himself as, quote, attempting to raise myself to the height of a lofty ideal, unquote. This lofty ideal is the wisdom of knowing what is and is not one's own. By establishing the regulative idea that the good and bad pertain only to the self, the Stoic, insofar as there is a commitment to this belief and the ensuing discipline of judgment, has a powerful motivation to remain faithful to the good, which means nothing less than to continue to identify with reason. It follows that it is not the state of being oneself that is defiance for the Stoics, as Kierkegaard would have. Rather, the state of failing to be oneself is in defiance, namely in defiance of the possibility of being good and instead choosing the bad. This still is not the absolute relation to oneself that Kierkegaard seeks in his work, but it is certainly not a self for which rebellion is legitimate. Any act of rebellion must ignore the proper place of reason, the divinity of reason, and relinquish control over the only thing one actually has control over in the Stoic view. The problem is that the Stoic, as master of himself, can at any moment erect a new regulative ideal and become, for example, an Epicurean or a peripatetic instead. Right? The first two responses then that we've looked at, one which allows for rebellion and the other which tries to undermine it through a regulative ideal, do not really address Kierkegaard's main concern, namely that the Stoics are in despair, at least sometimes. Despair, in Kierkegaard's sense, is to hope for death because of one's inability or failure to live, that is, to be oneself. Insofar as even the most rigorous Stoic will sometimes fail to identify with reason, there are sure to be occasions for despair. Marcus Aurelius is constantly reminding himself to be good in his meditations, presumably because he is not being good at the moment he is writing or is struggling to remain good. He even manifests something like the despair of defiance. Quote, "Come quickly, death, lest I, like them, forget myself," he says. But it is just here, when despair emerges, that the Stoics blame themselves for its emergence and remind themselves to be better next time, that providence is in fact behind everything, and that they should face life with the calm confidence of a flowing stream that absorbs what is thrown into it and washes it away. What allows the Stoics to be like the stream is not correct judgment alone, but also the belief that whatever is thrown into the stream, so to speak, is done so providentially, and hence is nothing to get upset about. Kierkegaard, because he is looking for God to play a role in the dialectical self-relation of the individual, overlooks the role of God as providential orderer of the universe. For the Stoics, the domains of the self as reason and the world as providentially ordered are ultimately interpenetrating. The self is affected by the world in various ways, but entering into a particular mode of self-relation defines the conditions of the sensitivity of the self with respect to the affectivity of the world, such that anything that happens, good, bad, or indifferent, will not disrupt that self-relation. Likewise, understanding the world itself in a particular mode serves to force the Stoic to recognize that the self cannot be negatively affected by the world because the world itself is ultimately, in the final analysis, good. Despair, then, is not eliminated from Stoic life through an internal dialectic between the self and God, like Kierkegaard wants, but rather through a process of self-identification, always and everywhere supported by an ability to cope with events in the world as ultimately reasonable and ordered according to the divine plan. As an aside, briefly, I'll just say that the Stoic view of providence as reason is shared by others, and in different forms is an essential feature of the Western tradition, whether in its secular or religious manifestations. A topic for another paper would be to show how the religious view of providence becomes the principle of sufficient reason in secular hands. I mention this to illustrate that the Stoic ethics is not narrowly circumscribed to the religiosity of ancient Greece and Rome, but rests more fundamentally on a conception of the universe as intelligible for finite knowing. The Stoics use the fact that everything happens for a reason as a reassurance in the face of seemingly unfortunate events. Right? This reassurance can take on the form of God's benign will, or it can take the form of the necessity of explanation. Okay. The next section now, the world and nihilism. Okay. So the domain of the world or nature is that domain within which we relate to things or externals in one way or another. Right? We can be dominated by the movement and alteration in the world, pleased by its beauty, overawed by its power, or indifferent to all of its turbulence and peacefulness alike. Right? Kelly and Dreyfus, henceforth I'll just say Kelly to stand in for both of them, are concerned with discovering a mode of life that would lead to a relation to the world that is full of gratitude and meaningfulness. To this end, they describe a discipline that they call metapoiesis, which is a twofold retrieval. A retrieval of Homeric responsiveness to the presence of the gods, phusis they term this, and of pre-technological craftsmanship, or poiesis. The Stoics, too, establish a discipline with a similar aim, namely the discipline of desire, whose aim is achieving a relationship of harmony with the world, where harmony is to desire whatever happens in the world. According to Kelly, the discipline of desire does not serve individuals very well. He sees the dominance of the blind goddess Fortuna in the Roman world as the cause of the Stoic discipline of desire, whose aim of harmony he describes as, quote, inoculation, reserve, and willfully enforced detachment, unquote. This is an ontological critique of Stoicism, which is to say, rather than assess the internal coherence of the theory or to ask about how convincing the arguments in favor of it are, Kelly looks instead at what kind of understanding of being is operative in the culture in which Stoicism emerged. He claims that beings in the Roman world were experienced by the Romans as having fortuna or blind chance as their origin or cause. That is, beings and events just didn't show up as meaningful or purposive in the Roman era. The response that the Stoics developed to this world was naturally one of detachment as an attempt to, quote, stalwartly endure the vicissitudes of life, unquote, through the discipline of desire and the aim of harmony. This picture of Stoicism fits nicely in the larger narrative Kelly is working out in his book, but it fails to grasp what I take to be an essential element of Stoicism, the engaged rather than detached stance the Stoics advocate. This fundamental attachment to the world has actually been given by Foucault as an explanation for the development of Stoic practices, an explanation not necessarily incompatible with Kelly's ontological explanation, but that does lead us to a very different picture of Stoicism nonetheless. Foucault notices that Stoicism, quote, came to constitute a social practice, giving rise to relationships between individuals, to exchanges and communications, and at times even to institutions, unquote. Without getting too involved in Foucault's description of Stoic practice, we can identify a few salient points in order to emphasize, against Kelly, Stoic attachment rather than detachment. The question of the self becomes problematized not in isolation, but rather specifically in relation to changing structures in marriage and politics. Stoicism does not present, quote, a choice between participation and abstention, unquote, with respect to marriage and politics. Of course, one will engage in these practices. Right? Rather, the Stoics' concern with the care of the self, of which the discipline of desire is a part, stems from a concern to, quote, Foucault now, define the principles of a relation to self that make it possible to set the forms and conditions in which political action, participation in the offices of power, the exercise of a function will be possible or not possible, acceptable or necessary, unquote. The question of detachment must be understood in this context. Right? It emerges, that is the question of detachment that Kelly raises, only within an attempt to remain involved in the private, social, and political domains in the right way. Right? Seneca is the best example of this type of highly involved Stoic for whom philosophy becomes not an escape from life, but rather the discipline of entering into life in the best and most virtuous way possible. This is not to say that Epictetus and Marcus are not also of the same view. The difference is one of emphasis. And also, if we look to their lives, we could see the difference as well. In a passage from On the Happy Life, Seneca describes what Stoic happiness is with respect to two of the domains, the self and the world. And this is a little lengthy quote here from Seneca. Accordingly, the happy life is the one that is in harmony with its own nature, and the only way it can be achieved is if, first, the mind is sound and constantly in possession of its sanity, that's the discipline of the self, right, and of judgment, and secondly, if it is brave and vigorous, and in addition, capable of the noblest endurance, adapting to every new situation, and finally, if it concerns itself with all the things that enhance life without showing undue respect for any of them, taking advantage of fortune's gifts, but not becoming their slave. The self is in harmony with itself when it possesses itself, right? Or identifies with its proper self, that is reason, as was shown above. But in addition to the solipsistic identification with self, we need virtues that are directed towards things outside of us, right? Endurance and adaptability are called for when fortune throws a curveball at us, right? Bravery and vigor when it's time to charge the mound, right? Or if charging the mound is too extreme for the Stoics, giving the umpire an earful, right? In other words, the second point Seneca wants to make in this passage is that as a part of the discipline of desire, we need to cultivate a number of virtues for coping successfully with the chance events of the world. The other side of the coin of adaptability and endurance is a sensitivity to those good things in life that can serve to enhance it, like bases loaded and no outs, to stick with the metaphor. The Stoic ball player doesn't gripe when the bases aren't loaded, but he swings for the fences when they are, right? Yet Kelly will want to claim that the Stoic is undisturbed when he strikes out, right? Revealing what is ultimately his primordial detachment from the situation. In a sense, this is correct, but the Stoic reply is very simple and compelling. Would you rather have a ball player on your team who returns to the dugout knocking things over and cursing his fate, or one who returns to the dugout unaffected but ready for the next task? But the Stoic detachment is still not understood fully enough to reply to Kelly. It is not that the Stoic ball player doesn't care about the game. Quote, in fact, it is morally wrong not to care and contrary to our nature. That's Epictetus. It is even reasonable to have realistic desires that one can relegate to a secondary role while still giving them what attention you can spare. Also, it is perfectly natural to recognize beauty when it is present, right? But never reasonable to turn into a Paris and run off after it, forgetting the bonds of friendship and diplomacy. Right? Baseball is fine, even good in a secondary way, and one can play it as much as one likes without failing to identify with reason, without forgetting what is truly good, and without abandoning one's duties. Of the latter, that is duties, we'll have more to say in the last section. In the face of widespread misinterpretation, it's worth emphasizing yet again that the Stoics really thought that care, as opposed to indifference, is the essence of human existence. Others have noticed this. Heidegger, in his only reference to the Stoics in Being and Time, mentions Seneca not in relation, as we might expect, to anxiety or resoluteness, but rather in the interpretation of Dasein as care. He quotes a passage from the letters, Seneca's letters, where he writes, quote, where Seneca writes, the good of human being is fulfilled by care. Right. Examples could be duplicated at greater length, but I'll allow these to suffice for now. However, I suspect that Kelly would still object, granting that the Stoics care about themselves and some secondary goods maybe, or some preferred indifference, that they can have, but that they can have no motivation for choosing one thing over another if they always remain unaffected by whatever they choose or encounter. Right? This echoes Nietzsche's claim mentioned above that in a state of self-control one can, I didn't mention this above, Nietzsche's claim that in a state of self-control one can neither be open to the beautiful fortuities in the soul, nor can one learn from anything outside oneself, if what is outside lacks all efficaciousness in the self-controlled person's soul. These commentators are correct in asserting the undisturbed nature of the perfect Stoic or the sage, but this fails to amount to an argument that the Stoic lacks motivation for choice, as I'll demonstrate. Firstly, and most compellingly to my mind, projects and goals may be pursued to their full length and completion if they do not end up becoming world or self-defining commitments. I can play baseball, but I cannot think of myself as essentially a baseball player. Right? To do so would be bad faith anyway. Right? Rather, I play baseball to my heart's content, but never lose sight of the meaning of baseball in the grand scheme of things. Right? It's ultimately is just bodies changing place, and as such is neither good nor bad, but rather an indifferent. However, my relation to the game can be either good or bad, depending on my disposition and manner of attachment. That is, the game isn't good, but my relation to the game can be good. Right? Secondly, and less compelling to most contemporary ears, is the injunction to perform one's duties. In Marcus, this seems to have a nearly central role, and understandably so. As emperor of the world's largest empire, he was surely bombarded with duties beyond anything the average person today could imagine. But the former slave Epictetus, whom one might expect to spurn duty as a burden reminiscent of his earlier life as a slave, also champions the role of duty for the good life. One of his examples is being called to testify in court. But if reason demands that you appear in court, and it demands that you do your best to be persuasive, you must do what is entailed while safeguarding what is yours, unquote. But why should we do what duty demands of us? What does it mean for reason to demand duty of us? To satisfactorily answer these questions, the domain of the community must be brought in here. And now I'll come down to the community and apathy. Okay. So the community is that domain within which we relate to others, right, and make choices that affect them in various ways. There are at least a few subdomains within the community that each warrant specific attention, namely the relation of the individual to friends, lovers, family, and the city, right? Here I will give attention only to these subdomains insofar as each of them is related to the passions. Nussbaum makes the passions, mostly love and anger, the focus of her comprehensive study of Hellenistic philosophy. She thinks the Stoics give up too much when they advise against passionate commitments. Quote, "The bold Stoic attempt, rigorously carried through, ends by removing as well its finite humanity, its risk-taking loyalty, its passionate love." Right? Unquote. There are at least two different roads to take by means of which one could answer Nussbaum's criticism. One road defends the Stoics on Nussbaum's terms, that is, in light of her reading of Stoic extirpation of passions. The second rejects that interpretation in favor of a view not of extirpation of the passions, but rather of their modification. For the sake of brevity, I'll take the first road. I'm also, now some time later after having written this, convinced that the second road wouldn't work anyway, as a good interpretation of Stoic thinking. Assuming that the Stoics do in fact extirpate the passions, the first thing to consider is what the upshot of this is. A passion, such as love, is a type of relation one person has to another, right? This relation, when raised to its highest pitch, can become constitutive for the lives of those involved, right? That is, the guiding motive for decision and choice comes to be the love that one feels. The meaningful experiences and the significance of situations are ultimately explicable in virtue of the passion. Indeed, the world itself comes to be illuminated by the passion's guiding light. To give up all the passions, then, is to give up the opportunity of being guided through life in this way. The Stoics have a different way of viewing the guiding force of passion in human life. Opening up possibilities and illuminating things as meaningful while darkening others as irrelevant is surely passion's task, but this is precisely, on the Stoic view, the height of slavery. Right? To allow a passion to determine what is good and bad, relevant and indifferent, is to allow passion to usurp reason's own most capacity. Quote, "If your lovesick condition isn't slavery, then what is?" Unquote, says Epictetus. For not only does love come to determine what is good and bad, it also, when it goes awry, compels us to do things we don't want to do. Right? Epictetus again. "Didn't you ever risk going out at night where you didn't want to go? Spend more money than you had intended? Say things in the course of the evening in accents of misery and woe? Put up with being mocked and finally locked out? What right do you still have to call yourself free?" Unquote. Nussbaum doesn't think there is anything truly wrong with this condition of slavery. As she reveals, it is primarily the Stoic arguments against anger that she was interested in when she began her project. In her view, love and grief are parts of human life that are too important to get rid of, even if they sometimes or always enslave us and lead us to do harm. She agrees that they can enslave us and oftentimes will, but still maintains that they're not worth getting rid of. So she says, quote, "The education I recommend looks with mercy at the ambivalent excellence and passion of a human life," unquote. This is to say that rather than exhort the enslaved, lovesick youth, Nussbaum would advise treating her with mercy instead, and point out that humans are frail and imperfect, needy and slavish. Nussbaum reasons from a position that is reinforced by people's everyday sense for what human life is and what it can achieve. Passion is typically seen as at least important to human life, if not absolutely essential to its success. But calling this everyday sense of things into question is precisely the genius of the Stoics. By shifting our perspective on the passions, they reveal to us that we have been enslaved to them all along, and that freedom, understood as a refusal to tolerate captivity and proper self-identification, will result in a state more joyous than any fleeting pleasures the passions might bestow on us could give. Besides the supposedly subpar human life that results from the absence of passion, another problem with the self-certainty of the Stoic is to make sense of how commitment to others and the community as a whole can be secure and enduring without passion. This is the place to answer the question of duty raised earlier. Friendship will serve here as the exemplar of duty as such. Epictetus argues, first, that identifying anything other than the self, which is reason, or will as good or bad results in concern or love for the good externals and hatred for the bad ones. If money is identified as good, for example, then one will invariably go for the money to the detriment of a friendship, should a conflict arise between the two. Right? Such is the case with judging anything but the self as good. Right? Whatever that good is, it will inevitably come between friends, family, community, and even one's own true self-interest. The second part of this argument is that only by identifying with reason and judging one's own acts as the only things that qualify as good or bad can true friendship flourish. Privatively, once the realm of choice becomes the only thing one concerns oneself with, there is nothing left to come between friends. Right? Positively, only when the proper mode of identity is taken up will my self-interest be served by remaining loyal, honest, patient, tolerant, and supportive, and by maintaining social relations. One might ask, how do these virtues serve my self-interest? Epictetus seems to suggest that these dispositions are the only reasonable way to interact with people, if there is nothing else that comes between them. So by always practicing patience with family members, even if they do not do so themselves, eventually one is likely to win them over to the same disposition. Being supportive of friends will not only guide them towards virtue, but also incline them to be supportive of yourself when support is needed. Duty, then, does not depend on passion or commitments made on the basis of passion, nor does duty depend on slavish servitude to some group of rules. Right? Duty to others is actually what is best for the reasonable person. So to answer the question earlier directly, we should do what duty demands of us because it is best for us to do what duty demands of us. What is best for the Stoics is whatever sustains the correct relation one has to oneself, right? The correct disposition to the world and the correct treatment of others. Thus, reason demands something means that reason persuasively argues for a particular manner of relating to others in one's life, which incidentally is by relating to them in the way our everyday sense of kindness and goodness already tells us to. The difference, though, is that it is not passion nor devotion to blood or city that motivates our behavior, but rather self-interest, where self here is identified with reason. Right? So I've argued that a Stoic life, rather than being characterized by despair, nihilism, and apathy, is in fact confidently content, engaged in meaningful practices, and committed for the right reasons to others and the community. I've tried to illustrate throughout that the ability of the Stoic to meet the criticisms I have addressed is dependent on the three disciplines, right? That of judgment, assent to the world, and proper control of choice or impulse. These three disciplines allow the Stoics to be certain, or allows the Stoic to be certain about herself, amicably disposed to the chance events of nature, and meaningfully involved in interpersonal relationships. What I have not done is argued positively for Stoicism against other competing views, but this paper has given a sort of basis for doing something like that.